Alright, so we're going to make our dry rub here, and the ingredients that go to the dry rub are as follows. First off, we have kosher salt, which is important. It's kosher salt, not table salt, because you want those nice big crystals. We get some coarse ground black pepper. Next up, we get garlic powder. It's just to add a little bit of flavor. Onion powder, same thing, and paprika to give it a little bit of color. So for a pork rub, I like to use 2 to 1 pepper to salt. So we'll put some salt in there. This might be too much. I might be going overboard here. So I'm going to put about double that amount of pepper in. That looks about right. And the rest of the stuff you just kind of put on top. So you can see I'm not putting a ton in there. I'm just putting enough to add a little bit of flavor. A lot of this stuff will probably burn off in the cook anyways, but onion powder very much. All right, add some of this. I'm gonna have to mash that up. And finally, paprika. I think we're gonna use up most of the rest of this. That's pretty good. So I like to use one of these leftover shakers. Pour this stuff in and shake it up. I can already feel the sneeze coming. Give it a shake. That looks pretty good. Yeah, you can see it's still got the same consistent. I got this darn piece of garlic that's just in there. I'll have to crush that out later. Oh, the sneeze really wants to come. And that's pretty much it for the rub. The first step to setting up the smoker is to line the water pan with foil. Although I don't actually fill the water pan for a pork butt, this serves as a drip tray for the grease and makes it much easier to clean up the next day. For something like a brisket, I always make sure to fill this with boiling water first, but I find pork shoulder generally stays pretty moist no matter what you do. Leaving the water pan empty also burns through coal at about 2/3 of the normal rate, so if you can avoid filling it, it'll save you some money on fuel as well. With the water pan lined, it's time to put the upper section back together and get the coal hopper and starter chimney ready. To start with, I fill the hopper level with the top. Then I take the fresh coals from the top and use those to fill the chimney. As I transfer coals from the hopper to the chimney, I try to hollow out a hole in the center of the hopper. Once the coals in the chimney are lit, I'll pour them into this hole where they'll quickly light the other coals. To light the chimney, I find the paper bags that the coal comes in to work great when they're torn into strips and rolled up. One thing you never want to do when you're using a smoker is to use lighter fluid to start the coals. Finally, I set the temperature probe in the pit. It's important to clip the probe to the cooking surface if possible, as the temperature here is going to be what matters most to the food you're cooking. That said, depending how large your roast is, you might not have room to put it right in the middle. A good rule of thumb that I generally use is to try to keep the temperature probe no closer than 2 inches to your meat, as the air around your food will generally be a lot cooler than the air inside the cooking chamber, so it's important to keep that accurate. To make cooking easier, I use a temperature regulator that controls a fan connected to the lower portion of the smoker. This regulator controls the airflow to keep the temperature at a set point for the entirety of the cook. Now that the smoker's all set up, we're ready to light the chimney and head back inside while it gets going. Alright, so now that we got the smoker started out there, well, at least we got the chimney started. While that's heating up, we're going to get this pork butt out of the wrapper, try not to make a huge mess, and get the rub on it. So let's start by just trying to find a opportune place to cut into this that's not going to cause blood to spray all over my counter. I usually like to start on the top and just use the top of the knife to cut through. So I'm just going to try to get a opening that I can pull this thing out and then throw the wrapper just straight into the trash below me here. So, all right, looks like I can hopefully pull this guy out.
Oof.
And that was pretty good. I did a good job so far. Don't want to jinx myself. Got all the blood in there. Perfect. Right into the trash. All right. Now, as I said, the trimming procedures for this pretty simple. You take your knife and you set it to the side because you don't trim it at all. The thing you do that I don't actually do with brisket is I put some olive oil onto my pork butt. I like putting olive oil on it just so more rub sticks. This is a pretty huge chunk of meat, and unlike the brisket, my opinion of pork is it's kind of bland, and so really caking this thing with a lot of rub helps it quite a bit. Combined with the smoke flavor, you can come out with a really good roast when it's done, even with enough rub that you can't even see the surface of the meat almost. So I'm going to do both sides here. I guess we can do a little bit of talk a little bit about what this cut of meat is. So this is a pork butt, or sometimes you'll see them in the grocery store as a Boston butt. And despite the name, it is actually part of the pork shoulder. It's got one big bone that's called the blade bone. You can see it right here. This is actually, I try to get the ones with the bone in. You can get bone out, but honestly, my opinion is they're kind of a mess. They kind of fall apart. Like you can see there's a couple of muscles here. Without the bone in there to hold that together, if I tried to pick this thing up and there was no bone, it would just fall into like 3 pieces in my hand. So I like bone in. When the thing's done smoking, you'll see later, very, very easy to get the bone out of there. The thing just slides right out. And actually, that's a good way to tell if the pork butt's done. So now that I got this thing slathered up with some olive oil, I'm gonna take the rub that we prepared earlier. You literally just start shaking this stuff on. You'll see as I go, I give it a pretty liberal coating. You can certainly go less, but as I said with a pork butt, I think there's a lot of meat in here. This is quite a bit thicker than a brisket is. So, and unlike a brisket, you're not slicing it up, so you're really relying on the rub to get the flavor. In addition to the smoke too, but this also, you usually don't expose a pork butt to as much smoke as a brisket. You wrap it earlier rather. So I'm gonna go over all the sides here, tip it to get every angle, and just really load this guy up. Now, if you've done pulled pork before, you may have done a version that used barbecue sauce, and that's pretty common of I think like Carolina and like Kansas City. I know they do like heavy sauces. This particular recipe is more of Texas style cook. So dry rub and smoke and not much else. That said, once it's done, once you pull it out and shred it up, the world is yours. You can put whatever you want in there for sauce. It really take anything. A lot of times when I eat this, I'll pour some sauce on and mix it up, and it tastes great. So, but that said, I also would say with this particular recipe, you don't need sauce at all. It tastes great just by itself. So yeah, as you can see, I'm like completely coating this guy. There's like almost no meat visible. All right, so this thing is sitting. You got it rubbed. Next thing we're gonna do, I'm gonna wash my hands, and we're gonna go take a look at the fire and see see if the chimney is lit and fully ready. Once that charcoal chimney is shooting flames out the top, it's ready to put into the smoker and turn the fans on. So let's go over here and see my messy apartment.
That's bad. I'm sorry. He didn't tell me we were doing this, so I didn't get a chance to tidy.
And it looks like that needs a few more minutes, so we'll give it a minute and come back in a few. All right, so here we are. The smoker has finally come up to temp 275, and it's a good thing because it's almost midnight. I gotta get this pork butt on and head to bed. When I'm cooking a single pork butt, I generally put the roast on the lower rack so that I can keep the temperature probe centered on the top rack. I place the roast fat side up on the rack because I found that over many hours of cooking, the fat can render down and get stuck to the grate, causing you to lose some of the surface of the meat when you go to wrap it. It might not seem like a big deal, but the surface of the meat is where all the delicious smoky flavor accumulates, so it's important not to ruin this. Before I head back inside, I make sure to close the top vent on the smoker to about 40%. While the smoker is heating up, this vent remains all the way open in order to clear out some of the dirty smoke that gets created when coals are lighting. But by this point, we can close it to conserve a bit more hot air and ultimately improve our coal efficiency. Next up, we need to let the smoker warm back up to temp, and then we'll add our wood chunks for flavor. For wood flavor, I generally go with either hickory or apple wood chunks. I know some people who've smoked over mesquite as well, and for a short smoke or a high temp grill, mesquite works great. But for a long smoke like we're doing here tonight, mesquite would ultimately end up imparting way too strong of a flavor. For my briskets and pork butts, I only use about 2 or 3 medium-sized chunks of wood, and other than that, I let the coals do all of the cooking. With the wood on the fire and the meat cooking, it's time to set an alarm and head to bed. So what we're looking for, and what I think we'll see, is yes, the top of this pork butt. We get a nice bark on it. You can see that the fat is sort of split on the top, and we've exposed the layer below, but we get that really beautiful, nice dark, almost brisket-like bark on the rest of it. So what I'm going to do here is pull this guy off, put it into some aluminum foil, spray it down with a little bit of my apple cider vinegar here, and wrap it up, put it back in for another probably 4 hours or so. Just wrap this guy up, wrap it up good and tight here. Pretty good. With the pork butt wrapped, it's time to set our next alarm for another 4 hours and head back to bed. Alright, it's about 10 a.m. and I'm getting ready to pull this pork butt off. I got a tray down here that I'm going to catch it in because this thing's going to be pretty hot. I'm just going to open the lid here, take this thing out with my handy pit mitts, and just do the transfer. Alright, you'll notice this thing here, if I wiggle it around, it's kind of loose, and that's your clue, without unwrapping this thing, that it's pretty good. You should feel, I don't know, almost like a pile of blankets, sort of softness in this thing. So we'll take this in and open her up real quick. So now that we're inside, I'm gonna just really carefully flip this guy over and unwrap both sides. So here we are, and you can see this thing looks absolutely delicious. See if I can see the bone. Yeah, the bone's right back here. So this bone should be loose enough that I can, yeah, you can see this thing. This thing's like ready to slide out, which is perfect. That's your other, once you have the pork butt open, your way of knowing that this thing's ready is if this bone just kind of lifts up out. We're not going to do it yet. We're going to take this, we're going to cover this back up and leave it for like an hour or so. But yeah, this thing should be ready to shred in about an hour. Alright, so this thing's rested for at least an hour now. So, time to go ahead and shred this thing. I like to use a couple of forks. That said, you could just easily get by with tongs or whatever, really. So, get this thing out of the foil. You'll see there's a little bit of foil that's stuck to it in a couple places, and this is the reason that I don't cook my pork butts fat side down, because the more fat that's pressed against this paper, or pressed against the foil, the worse it'll stick. Now this is actually stuck to the bone, so you'll see here I'm going to try to pull the bone out. This thing should pretty much just kind of come out with very little resistance. Yeah, and the meat just falls right off it. And that's exactly what you want right there. Nice, clean bone. You can set that aside and make broth with it, or you can just chuck it. I usually just give it to my roommate. Sorry, look at my finger. Already I can tell this tastes really good. So, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and just start ripping this guy apart. And there really isn't too much to this. You just don't want to do it too early. You start ripping this guy apart too early, you're going to start doing it and just see a bunch of steam come up out of it. And that is going to be all the moisture that your meat had gone in an instant, basically. So let the thing cool off, let it keep its juices. It'll reabsorb a lot of the juices that came out during the cook while it was wrapped. So it's really important to give this thing time to rest. That's pretty much the same with just about any meat you cook. You don't want to just cut into it immediately. You might end up with some of the corners, like this corner here is a little bit burned. It's kind of crispy. I might pull this guy out. This isn't really super edible. There's definitely some meat on there, but I think some of this, I could have cut this off. This is one part where you can trim that and you won't have to deal with this kind of stuff. But there really shouldn't be very much of that kind of meat in there. This thing should come apart nice and easy. I had this on for something like 10 hours. I usually like to at least 8 hours, but with pulled pork, for what I found, you can really just kind of let loose and just cook it as long as you want for the most part. I mean, you don't want to cook it for like 20 hours, but so yeah, with pulled pork, the other thing is, like with this stuff, I never go by temperature. With a brisket, it's a lot different. Brisket, you got to be really careful about when you switch stages, like when you wrap it, and when you take it off. Like those are like super critical. Pork butt, you can put the thing on. If you get it wrapped in 4 hours, great. If you get it wrapped in 5 hours, great. If you don't wrap it at all, probably won't matter, but it might be a little bit less juicy when you pull it out. If you're shredding it and you notice that the meat is giving you a lot of resistance, that's a hint that you probably undercooked it. I really can't stress enough that with pulled pork, it really, like, if the goal is to overcook this thing. You want to cook it to the point where it just falls apart. That's not the same if you're doing like ribs. If you're trying to smoke ribs, there's like ribs are more like brisket. There's a small window where they are the best. And if you miss the window, it's either going to be too soft, or if you do it too early, they're going to come off and they're going to be not soft enough. But pulled pork, yeah, I just cook the crap out of this stuff, and it always will come out good no matter what. Keep the temperature at 275. Wrap it after 4 hours, but not before. And pull it off after 8 to 10 hours, however you feel. So we're getting close here. Yeah, and like I said, it's important. Don't be afraid of this the crust or the bark in this thing. That's actually where a lot of the really tasty flavor is. So you want to mix that up in with everything else. At this point, if you're a sauce person, you can just add your sauce, mix it in, and you'll be good to go. It's not going to ruin the work you did getting this bark. Important part of the bark is just you want to get those smoke flavors in there. It's the whole point of doing it this way. You do it in a crock pot. I used to do pulled pork in a crock pot. You can do a pretty good pulled pork in a crock pot, but it's not close as good as smoked. Smoked meat is better than non-smoked meat in my opinion. All right, well, I guess I'm gonna wrap this up and make myself some lunch.